Spada in 2007 in an encyclopedia, she asked the question, what is communicative language teaching? And she answered it. The answer to this question seems to depend on whom you ask. And Jeremy Harmer, who wrote several very influential books on the practice of language teaching, he also said a similar thing. The problem with CLT is that the term has always meant a multitude of different things to different people. And Graham Hall has said something similar, which also uses similar words to what Kumar was using just now. Everyday classroom practices can appear to be quite different when CLT principles are applied in different social and educational contexts. In other words, the same principles can be applied in totally different ways in different contexts, and that is quite normal. Except, of course, that sometimes with CLT, a lot of confusion has been caused because many people have thought that they know exactly what it is and that they can pass it on to other people as a way of telling other people what they should do. So Kumar's classic definition of a fixed method, that CLT is a method which can be fixed up, passed to everybody. And perhaps even more dangerous, many teachers have always asked the question, I never know whether what I'm doing is really CLT. And it's caused them a lot of insecurity. This comes out of quite a lot of interviews, that many teachers think there's some version of CLT which they really ought to be practicing. And so they're always asking, am I really practicing it? And they're feeling insecure because they're not quite sure. So it's a good example, that, of how the concept of method is not only unclear, but can also actually be counterproductive in causing a lot of insecurity because people think it means something definite. So one of the problems has been that CLT has always had two major definitions, two different versions of CLT. And to make sense of that, I'll just point out these two different dimensions of learning that take place everywhere. And not only in language teaching, incidentally, learning any kind of subject. First of all, you can talk about an analytic dimension, which takes place through instruction. And in the case of language teaching, the main focus is likely to be on form and relating it to meaning of language. And a lot of conscious learning and practice might be drills, exercises, practice exercises, learning dialogues, learning vocabulary. Gradually, the language becomes more and more automatic and also more and more correct, but basically the correct version is taught right at the beginning, so we hope that it will be correct all the time. And gradually, as it becomes more automatic, it feeds into a person's communicative competence, and that is the goal of virtually all language teaching. Now, not all language teaching, but nearly all language teaching. Then the other dimension of teaching, of learning rather, the experiential dimension, the way that we learn our mother tongue, the way that we learn a language when we go suddenly into a foreign country, and the way that we learn a lot of foreign language, because we certainly don't learn everything through somebody telling us. There's a lot of aspect of your own English language skill, for example, which is learned experientially through communicating with the language. So there, the focus is on communication and with meanings and messages. A lot of subconscious learning going on, because you're not really conscious of what you're learning, it's subconscious. Gradually, as you use the language, it becomes more and more correct, more and more approaches more and more the target version of the language, and again feeds into your communicative competence. So those two types of learning are going on simultaneously with virtually all types of learning, not all types of learning, but many types of learning anyway. And so communicative language teaching grew up with two versions. Sometimes people talk about a weak version and a strong version. Now, in the weak version, people say that we can teach people to do things with words, that's to communicate, through analytic as well as experiential strategies. So those two things can be going on together. We can still teach the vocabulary, we can still get people to practice the grammar and things like that. We can point out, we can give grammatical explanations, but we can also get them to use the language for communicating so that they integrate everything together. So the weak version says that those two things can both go on together, whereas the strong version that came up says that, okay, if people learn by communicating, if that is the message, then we should try to get students to communicate all the time. Now, in the classroom, that has very different implications, obviously, because there's sort of pressure on the teacher feels that he or she should be having the students to communicate nearly all the time. Whereas the controlled grammar practice, exercises, teaching vocabulary, analysing separate bits of language, teaching pronunciation, etc., in addition to trying to create opportunities for the students to use the language for communication, because that is, after all, the goal. So you could say that that is like the task which eventually we want them to learn, is to be able to use the language for communication. So both of them, the weak and the strong versions, then they have differences, but both of them attach an important role to creating and organising communicative activities in class. In the strong version, everything that goes on in class would be a communicative activity, but very few people manage to do that, except with advanced learners. Of course, with advanced learners, you can do it very easily. Whereas the weak version gives a more familiar role to the teachers, but also involves creating communicative activities. And it's there that some of the misunderstandings and insecurity has arisen, because for many teachers that has been a sort of unfamiliar type of area. And various people have done interviews and things as to how people interpret communicative language teaching. Thompson, back in 1996, he used interviews. He interviewed teachers at workshops all over the world, and he travelled around the world doing workshops. And the most common interpretations that he came up were, it means using pair work and group work. It means teaching only speaking. Now, some of these things, you see, come as quite a shock to a person who is suddenly confronted with the notion of communicative language teaching. I've got to use nearly always pair and group work. I've got to teach only speaking, and I've not got to teach grammar. That used to be a very common representation of communicative language teaching, that we don't teach grammar anymore. It has no foundation whatsoever in theory or anything, and also most teachers, you know, they're what Kuba called their sense of plausibility, told them much better that grammar is a necessary part of language learning. But many people got that message from communicative language teaching. And maybe more than anything, it means a lot of hard work for the teacher, because it means a lot of preparation of materials. Your old textbooks are not good enough now. You've got to create a lot of personalised materials, which means a lot of work, really. And in East Asia, it has been similar things, mainly interpreted as giving students opportunity to practice the skills taught, but also providing teachers with communicative activities in their repertoire of skills. So this status of communicative activities is quite central. And it's that mainly that has led to some practical challenges that teachers have felt. Not everywhere in the world, but it's mainly in Asia that people have talked about it a lot, because there's been such a lot of things going on in Asia. So various studies of teachers in China have noted down some of the challenges that they feel. You remember the old Prime Minister, Tony Blair, in the UK. One of his favourite sayings about Britain was, "We have no problems in Britain, we have only challenges." So because of that, everywhere in my slides that I used to put problems, I now put challenges. And it's better, actually. The problem makes you feel depressed, whereas a challenge enervates you. It is true. So teachers in China and in other parts, many countries, certainly all the countries in Asia where people have looked at it, look at some of the things, new organisational skills for group activities, unfamiliar roles in the classroom for traditional teachers, that is, who have always sort of taught within the educational tradition of of the country. So a facilitator, not just a knowledge transmitter, but also a facilitator of learning or understanding the personalities of the students and everything. Students who, classroom management, especially with large classes, teachers have had problems with classroom management, and they're sort of worried about having the students all communicating, and they might lose control. Students resorting to the mother tongue in tasks. So when you give them communicative activities, you know, very soon, as soon as the teacher's back is turned, they start speaking in their mother tongue. That many teachers find. Or if they do keep to the language, performing the task with minimal language. So there's some classes in Hong Kong where students were observed and where the teacher hoped that they would use such complex language. In fact, they just pointed. They just pointed to things. They didn't use language at all because they could carry out the communication activity or the task without actually using language at all. And sometimes excessive demands on language competence, not only of the students, but also of the teachers as well, who have not, in many countries, had very much opportunity to speak the language. And also often conflicting with the educational traditions and conceptions of learning in a particular country, where the teacher is still seen as seen as the knowledge transmitter, and the students are seen as the receivers, or you know, not sharing in the authority, if you like, but having different conceptions of learning. And perhaps one of the most common things that comes up is that it seems to be incompatible with public examinations. That in many countries you read that the teachers would love to be doing lots of communicative activities, lots of games, lots of all this, but they find that the public examinations are still based on the old grammatical notion, learning individual items, pencil and paper types of activities, which not only does the teacher feel that they might not be preparing the students, but of course the students themselves feel, and sometimes even more, the parents feel that this approach is really not preparing them, the students. So CLT as a package, if you like, maybe as a package in the way that Kumar talked about a set method. You know, CLT as a method. Gradually, in many countries, sort of came to fall out of favour, if you like. People were not so keen on it. Didn't seem to be fitting the bill at all. But these are quotations from a gentleman in Vietnam, who I think puts it rather well. He makes the point that though many teachers don't welcome CLT as a package of techniques and ideas which they should accept, but they're quite happy to accept what he calls the spirit of CLT. And he describes the CLT as being that we need to focus on the learners and the learning. We need to help learners to use the language effectively for their own communicative needs. And this is most likely to happen when classroom activities are real and meaningful to learners. It sounds very basic and very general and very vague, but actually, when you look at a lot of lessons there, a lot of the teaching does not seem to be in line with that. A lot of it seems to be teaching the language for its own sake and not really engaging the learners, teaching it like a sort of sometimes rather dull school subject. So, you know, this basic message is quite an important one. But then the question then comes, one of the questions, how then can this spirit of CLT be implemented in specific contexts where teachers teach? Because the spirit of CLT, the way it's just been presented on the previous slide, is actually a very broad thing. You can picture it being implemented in an almost infinite number of ways. But of course teaching becomes a very specific thing. You're in a specific classroom at a specific time. So how can this spirit be translated and implemented into specific contexts? Now this ties in again very much with what Kumar was saying about relating things to specific contexts. And I'm going to mention here three main things, but they overlap. One is to integrate CLT ideas and techniques into the established and familiar approach or the traditional approach that is used in a particular country. The second is develop a new framework of principles for developing a context-sensitive approach. And then the third, which actually can carry on together with all the others as well, is that teachers and researchers together explore key specific issues for communication-oriented language teaching. And when I say teachers and researchers together, I'm also assuming, I wish I'd built that into the slide more specifically, that teacher and researcher can very often be the same people. Kumar's phrase of the teacher as inquirer, the teacher inquiring about what's going on in his or her classroom, and so carrying out, whether you call it inquiry or whether you call it research, developing his or her own sort of method. Okay, so I'm just going to say a little bit about those in the next slide. The one about integrating CLT into a traditional approach. Here's an example from China. A teacher in Beijing who was studied by Zheng Xinmin, he did a lot of these things come from PhD research because the people have more time to do it. So he studied a teacher in China and looked at some of the things that he was doing. He was basically keeping his traditional role, the way he was accustomed to it from the Chinese learning tradition, giving as a knowledge transmitter, providing grammatical explanations, using pattern drills, using memorization techniques, all recognizable and familiar, where people would feel comfortable with it. But he was also integrating new ideas into what he was doing by, for example, organizing more interaction in his classroom. Not suddenly going all over into pair work and group work, but introducing pair work and group work gradually, and then, of course, gradually one can introduce more and more. Once you have a foothold in what's familiar, you can gradually work in more and more. Or eliciting more creative responses from students, not only asking questions where the answer is known to everybody, but there's only one answer, but getting more creative questions. Again, it can be built into the normal day-to-day question and answer type teaching, if you like. And then relating the language not only to the contexts which are in the textbook, which are sort of impersonal and not personalised, but also relating the language to the student's personal experience, things that are relevant to them as well. So all of those things then are ways in which he is sort of developing in the direction which, not because it's CLT, need to getting rid of the idea that we need to do it because it's CLT. I mean, in a sense, that's nonsense. Why should do it because it's CLT? But because it takes them in the direction of what they will eventually need to do with language, which is interacting with people, responding creatively to things, and talking about their own personal matters. So it's developing in that direction. Here's another example of how some Hong Kong teachers do it. So a study in Hong Kong, which I'll refer to later, found that very, very few teachers actually have communicative activities or so-called tasks in which the students create language, negotiating meaning. According to the official definition of task, the students are negotiating meaning with each other. Very few teachers did do that, but they wanted to express some of the ideas of CLT, so they used a lot of contextualized practice, practicing the language, but making sure it's now practiced within a context where the language is related to a situation or to their own experience, rather than disjointed and abstract. And Carlos, again, in a 2007 article for Hong Kong, he argues in favour of a situated task-based approach. So not a full-blown task-based approach where the theoreticians, the experts, tell us that task-based learning has become one of those things where as soon as you see the work, you're supposed to put up your hands and say, oh, that's good. Rather like one used to do with communicative language teaching, we were supposed to automatically think, that's good. It became a little bit similar with task-based language teaching. But He says that we need a task-based approach, and some of the things that people need to do in order to adapt it to the Hong Kong context is to better clarify the role of grammar instruction, where task-based language teaching is really often quite vague. Make clearer links with examination requirements, and then give more balance between oral tasks and other types of tasks, such as written tasks, because there's often still this idea that people ought to be talking all the time, doing communication through talking. But of course, you also communicate through writing, so that's also an important part of any kind of approach. It's part of the student's needs. I just put in a quick example from Korea, just to show how the similar things are going on, where a Korean teacher was observed, and this teacher focused mostly on teacher-led interaction, rather than the sort of creative group interaction which communicative language teaching is mainly associated with. And these two writers, John and Peck, they also argue for a contextualized CLT that suits the Korean context. And John said, it says in another article, it's time to seek a Korean way to develop communicative competence in English. So all going in this direction of finding ways which suits a particular context, rather than taking ideas and trying to put them into operation just because they're there. Incidentally, all of these references, if you want to have a copy of these references, my email address is at the end. I've got them all on a sheet. Well, actually, they're at the end of the PowerPoint, but they're very small anyway. If you want any, just email me. I can give you the detailed references. Okay, so all of that going on, of adapting it to specific contexts. But then, of course, we come to a point now, talking about CLT, where we have to ask the question, does this distinction between CLT and traditional really make sense anymore? Or would it, as Beaumont and Chang, as these two writers put it, perhaps it inhibits methodological development, perhaps because we're getting so caught up with this idea, this is CLT, this is traditional, perhaps those ideas themselves are outdated, and we shouldn't think in those terms. So why do we not view ideas and techniques from all sources, whether they're from traditional sources, so-called traditional, I use that as a kind of shorthand for the things, sort of most educational traditions, whether they're from CLT sources or from any other source, if it comes to that, seeing all of these as constituting a sort of common repertoire of ideas and techniques which all teachers can draw on anywhere, and which all teachers can contribute to anywhere. So talking about globalization, again Kumar mentioned the notion of globalization. This really is like the spirit of globalization nowadays, in that instead of people used to see it as things coming from the centre, such as the USA, and being spread to the rest of the world, now the concept is much more all people taking part in a sort of conversation about things from all parts of the world, and all ideas coming together. So should we not, maybe we should think of it in terms like that instead. And we need a broader, non-prescriptive conceptual framework in CLT. CLT has, whether intentionally or not, has been seen as a kind of prescriptive thing. Is it CLT or is it not CLT? Should I be doing it? Should I not be doing it? We don't want that kind of framework. It does not make sense. But can we think of some other non-prescriptive framework which will orient us towards creating experiences? This is the key thing. Creating experiences which are real and meaningful to the learners and help them to fulfill their communicative needs. Those seem to me to be two of the non-negotiable things that must be there, whatever approach you have. They have to be real and meaningful, otherwise no learning takes place, and they have to lead them towards the communicative needs, otherwise there's no point in the learning taking place in any case. So I'm going to talk about three approaches to doing that, and I'm going to get away from the term CLT, which communicative language teaching, and I'm going to start talking about COLT, communication-oriented language teaching, which seems to me to be much more sort of non-prescriptive in terms of what it's telling people to do and not to be doing. It's oriented towards getting people to communicate. So cult is the term which I will use from this point onwards, if I remember. But some of these things get so ingrained in your mind that you can't escape them. But I try to use cult now, if I can. If we wanted a game, we could have a prize for anybody who notices when I forget and use CLT, but I'm not sure who would give the prize, so I can't do that. Okay, so what about then these three approaches to Kumar again had a good way of saying it, a generalized framework of practices which make sense in practical terms and in theoretical terms. We can't just we've got this big repertoire of ideas and techniques. We can't splash around aimlessly in them, just choose a bit there, a bit there, a bit there, because we don't really know where we're going then. We've got to have some kind of set principled way of choosing one thing rather than another. Otherwise everything will become kind of random. So how do we go about this? These are three different approaches. One is to look at second language acquisition and say, what do we know about from second language acquisition? What do we know about language learning which could help us to deliver principles of effective instructed language learning? That's what we're doing in classrooms, really. We're trying to create instructed language learning. So can research into second language acquisition help us there? Second one is developing macro strategies for language teaching, based on teachers' experience, based on their sense of plausibility, what teachers feel works in the classroom, what we think from our general educational knowledge works in the classroom. Incidentally, I remember to mention now that this book, Kumar Adivalu 2003, is available in the translated Chinese version. I saw it outside on the desk, the big piles of this of 2003 Beyond Methods on the desk out there. Now the third one, designing a framework based on the accumulated experience of classroom learning and the nature of the goal of communicative competence, again really derived from experience and what we know about what works in classrooms. I'll spend most time looking at that one because there's not time. This book, Kumar Adivalu 2003, is available in the translated Chinese version. I saw it outside on the desk, the big piles of this of 2003 Beyond Methods on the desk out there. Then the third one, designing a framework based on the accumulated experience of classroom learning and the nature of the goal of communicative competence, again really derived from experience and what we know about what works in classrooms. I'll spend most time looking at that one because there's not time to go into detail on every one, and that's the one to which I personally, subscribe. I mean, purely because you can't be involved in everything simultaneously, and that's the one where I mainly focused on. So, just very briefly, the first one you can get the article on the internet, or quite often if you China has different relationships with Google. Is Google okay now? Google. Anyway, you can get a lot of these articles simply by Googling, So I'll just go quickly through and I won't elaborate on them. You can look at them in more detail. As an example, provide extensive L2 input from listening and reading, but provide also opportunities for output. Ensure that the learners focus predominantly on meaning, but also that they also focus on form. There's been a lot of debate in research circles about things which many teachers think are actually self-evident, namely that you should also sometimes focus on the forms of the language. But, there's been a lot of theoretical debate about that. But the opportunity to interact in the L2 is essential to developing proficiency. But respect the learner's natural sequences of development. No good trying to teach very complex things when they're still really at an early stage of development. They're not ready for it yet. Focus mainly on developing subconscious automatic knowledge, so there has to be a lot of room for practice, but also give them conscious knowledge so that they can monitor, correct, do things like that. Take account of individual differences in the classroom. Ensure that learners develop not only rules but also fixed expressions, and also in assessment, make sure you examine free production as well as controlled production. A lot of examinations, in fact, focus on controlled production and don't have time sometimes. You know, as soon as an educational system wants to lengthen the oral test, the public examination, it has phenomenal cost implications because you need such a lot more examiners. Okay, so that's one approach. The second approach, again, which I'll just sketch it out, and the book is out there. Unfortunately, I will not get a percentage of the profits, but it's there. So Kumar's set of macro strategies: maximise the learning opportunities, get them to learn at every occasion to learn, minimise perceptual mismatches, try to make sure everybody understands what's going on all the time, facilitate negotiated interactions, have a lot of interaction, contextualise the input, put it into situation, into context, integrate the language skills together. Activate intuitive heuristics, so build on the natural capability to problem solve and to inquire, to discover things. Promote learner autonomy. One of the things they find about motivation and learning is that the more autonomy students have, the more they can be self-regulated, the more effective they can learn, and the more happy they are as well, in fact. Raise cultural consciousness, which not only of their own culture, but also of all cultures, and ensure that things are relevant to the society. So there, again, you see that again is like a general framework which you can take, which does not actually prescribe what you do, but from each of those strategies, you could then develop specific sets of techniques which you could use in the classroom differently with different groups of learners. So I'll now go on to the third and final one, which is focused on. It came from me. It came largely from a lot of discussions that used to take place in Hong Kong about the differences between tasks and exercises, where tasks were supposed to be purposeful communication, exercises were meant to be focused on form, just teaching little bits of language, and a lot of this discussion seemed to me not to lead anywhere, because very often things were sort of half, a little bit of one and a little bit of others, and you couldn't always make a clear difference. So I decided I'd rather use a five-part framework for these different activities that go on in the classroom, which actually go from analytic strategies at one end to experiential strategies at the other end, with many in the middle, which are sort of halfway. And if you could say sort of from the ones on the left-hand side, focusing on forms, but also building in meanings. The ones on the right-hand side, focusing on meanings, and also getting the students to create messages. And so within this framework, you can sort of actually analyse your own teaching or somebody else's teaching. I'll give you examples of how, again, a PhD student analysed some teacher's teaching in terms of that, and one can move from one part to the other, if you like. So with non-communicative learning, that's where you're focusing on the structure of the language, how things are formed, your exercises, substitution exercises, only focusing on the language without any communication involved at all. What I call pre-communicative language practice, where you're still basically focusing on the language, but you're building in attention to meaning. The students have to pay attention to meaning in order to respond. So the sort of question and answer practice, where we're asking questions about a picture, but everybody can see the picture. But they're still having to look at the picture in order to respond. Communicative language practice, the additional thing built in there is that they now have to use the language which has been taught, just been taught, but they also have to express meanings there. Meanings. Structured communication, the one where you create situations in the classroom, but you've created them and structured them in such a way that you know the students can cope with them using the language that they've got. And then at the other end, authentic communication. This is the goal there we want people to get to be able to use the language for authentic communication. But the others are kind of sort of stages on the way to it. There's no kind of evaluation implied that some things in the classroom are intrinsically better than the others. But of course, one of the realities is that we hope to be able to get students to be able to use the language for authentic communication, and so that in terms of learners' needs, we want to try to get that far if we can. Just some examples. An example of non-communicative learning I put, where people simply have to analyse sentences and look at the position of the adverb, and they then have to create their own. They have to work out the rules, and then perhaps they have to do some others themselves. Non-communicative, they only have to look at the position. They don't have to understand anything, really. Pre-communicative language practice. I suppose the most common thing, part one of that, is teachers' question and answer practice, where the teacher is asking questions about a picture, questions about a situation in classroom. How many boys are there? What is the colour of John's jacket? How many windows are there in the classroom? All of those sorts of questions where everybody can see. And so there's no new communication, but they're having to look at the concepts. They're having to pay attention to meaning in order to answer the question. Now, there was a point in communicative language teaching where everybody poured scorn on that, on the grounds that no meanings were being communicated. Now, in my view, that doesn't matter. Well, it matters. It is significant, but it still means that it can be a very important stage on the way to internalising the language, making it part of your ideas and your structures. But then if we're going a little bit further towards the goal, where we have communicative language practice, here's an example where you might interview. I mean, common examples of these information gap activities, where one person has information and the other person has to ask questions in order to get the information and maybe put it onto a timetable or something like that. Or they have to find the differences between two pictures. Those very common things. Or another common one here, where they interview each other and have to find out things about the other. Or simply where the teacher asks questions to which he or she does not already know the answer. So it can be the same kind of practice, but now it's new meanings. Next one along, here's an example from the book by Penny of structured communication, where you're creating a situation where they have to imagine a world in the future. But you have been teaching them the future, and you feel very confident that they have the language to do that. So you're not throwing them in at the deep end, if you like, because you know that they have been using that. Some students might use a lot of new language, which they remember from long ago, or they may use communication strategies. Other students might simply use language that you've been teaching them. So it's structured, you've structured the situation in order to protect them, if you like a sheltered workshop, like a sheltered communication, where you know they can do it. But then at the other end, you're putting them in situations where you don't know what kinds of meanings are going to occur. So they've got to delve into their linguistic and communicative competence in order to use the language to express meanings which they cannot predict. Here's a short one where they have to talk about reasons why they like music, discuss it with classmates. A short one, that could be just a very short one. Here's a much longer one where they have to pick on some aspects of the environment which they would like to improve, work out ways in which they might like to improve it, and discuss it with people in their group and give presentations about it. So a much more demanding one, but still you don't know what sorts of meanings are going to come up. And in the work of Ribe and Vidal, where it's come from, they actually they have quite a useful discussion about 3 generations of tasks. This would be the first generation of task for them, where you're simply using your communicative skills. So this is just communicative development. This, I think, I haven't asked them, it's my interpretation, would be their second generation of tasks, where you're not only developing their communicative development, but also their cognitive development, because they're having to think about and analyse the world, right? And the third one would be their third generation of tasks, in which it's not only their communicative development and their cognitive development, but also their personality development, because they're having to organise things and think critically about things. You could also think of it in terms of these 4 C's that Kumar mentioned. You know, that the more you come towards this end, the more you're going to have those 4 C's: communication, creativity, and whatever the other 2 were. You could remember better than me. I've got them written down, but I can't think of the terms at the moment. Okay, so that's again within the area of sort of communication tasks. That's quite a useful way of thinking of how one can develop in that area. And it goes far beyond the sort of simple dichotomy, the simple distinction: exercises at one end, tasks at the other, and we've got to be doing tasks. That's too simple, I think. Too simple for the world. I don't mean too simple for us thinking. I mean, the simpler things are for us to think about, the better. But when they're so simple that they give the false picture of the world, then it's no good anymore. So, okay, so they go in that. So they go there. So that's the kind of development which can take place within any teacher's repertoire of teaching skills, if you like, or learner's repertoire of learning skills. You can't jump suddenly from box 1 to box 5, but you can gradually develop, and also therefore gradually develop the student's ability to use the language for their authentic means. Here's the result of a PhD study that Jessica Dunn did in Guangzhou, where she actually used this framework to analyse the lessons of 4 different teachers. And she found that almost all of the teaching, almost all of it, was in those first 3 boxes. So no further than communicative language practice. The students were not being involved in the other type. Again, don't mean that as an evaluation, just that if the students are going to be able to use language for complex purposes, for critical thinking, for communication, then at some point they're going to need to develop a broader range of communicative repertoire to cope with this. So she found then that, for example, the one teacher, 67.4% of what went on in her lessons was actually non-communicative. There was no connection to meaning at all. But at the other extreme, you've got one teacher, Jane, in school B, which actually was quite a favoured school. You know, the authorities gave it extra money, things like that, which could be significant. Where she had 36.4% of what went on was actually communicating things, communicative language practice. But even she, except for, I think, 1 or 2 activities, never went as far as the structured communication box. Keep an eye on the time. Yeah. So here's what one lesson, Rose's lesson. One of the teachers called Rose, and here's a sort of a more detailed examination of what went on in her lessons. That the 62.8% which were non-communicative learners, that's what they were: explanation, mechanical repetition, practice games, including a thing called the bomb game. And the bomb game is something where I think whenever a certain word is mentioned, they have to jump under the desk. Now, that would be labelled as non-communicative learning because they don't have to pay attention to meaning. But, and this is significant for what we're going to put on the next slide, it's one that the children enjoyed more than anything. So maybe they learned far more from that non-communicative activity. I don't know, we don't know. It wasn't measured. You know, they weren't tested according to how much they learned. You just don't know. So 32.1 were pre-communicative, were things like question and answer about a picture or a situation, or activities with actions, like where they had to respond to the teacher. Communicative language practice, not many, but guessing game, personal questions with information gap, what's missing game, what's missing in the picture. So communicative language practice, using the language but expressing some kind of message to each other. So that was the picture of it. Nearly all of it then in those three left-hand boxes, and very little in the two right-hand boxes at there. Now, so I mentioned specifically that the activity which I'm accustomed to turning around to a screen and pointing at it. I'd have to run an awful long way to point at those. Yeah, there. But like I said, the activity which the students found most interesting was this bomb game, where they weren't communicating at all. And that seemed to be very significant. But quite often, the sorts of activities where you feel the students are really engaged, really learning something, have got nothing to do with whether the games are communicative or not. They've got things to do with other things, whether we manage to elicit their engagement through relevant topic, through it being interesting, through the kind of interaction that they have there. And well, my argument would be, I've no proof for it whatsoever, that to have an engaging activity which is non-communicative is much more valuable for learning than a communicative activity which does not engage them, because they find it really too boring. No, it just seems to me to make sense. I don't know. Anyway, here's the other dimension, which I think is equally or maybe even more important. I don't know. The middle line is the same as what I just put on in this first box here. The middle line is the same as this, from non-communicative learning to authentic communication. Okay? That's the middle line, from form-oriented to message-oriented activities. Okay? But then the horizontal line is this second aspect of engagement, task engagement. To what extent are they engaged in the different tasks? And it seems to me that any methodological framework has to take account of both of these dimensions and see what we can do. And it will be different in different contexts. Nobody can legislate on what teachers should do here or there, because it will be different according to what context they're in, according to what they're able to do. You know, there are some activities which teachers can make extremely engaging because they're good actors, but for other teachers these would really be quite boring because they're not good actors. So it depends on things like the teacher's skills and personality as well. So the middle one goes from high engagement, includes also motivation. Of course, you know, engagement includes motivation, everything which engages the learner, engages the mind. Without mind engagement, it was in a book by Prabhu that I first read that term, mind engagement, but I can't find the book anymore where it was. But, you know, mind engagement is sort of the prerequisite for any learning to take place. So you have high engagement and you have low engagement, where nothing will take place. And using that matrix, I think you call it, you've got 4 boxes where you could think of different activities or try to develop different activities in different boxes. You've got activities in box A here which are form-oriented and boring. Of course, these are all matters of degree. It's not that something suddenly becomes boring or suddenly becomes engaging. It's all matters of degree. But then in B, you've got activities which are form-oriented but also engaging. That would be like the bomb activity which I mentioned just now. Right? But then on the other side, in the box at the bottom, you've got activities which are message-oriented, some kind of role play, for example, which happens to be rather boring role play, but not engaged, but boring. Or you've got activities up in D, which are both message-oriented and engaging. Now that would be where the authentic communication activities really have their most effect on learning. Kumar mentioned language and ideology, communicative ideology. built up over the years, in spite of myself, is actually reflected in that, in the way that I phrased everything there. I'm very fascinated by the words and but, which reveal such a lot about the opinion of the person using them. So the fact that I've put up there in B, form-oriented but engaging, shows that I've not yet been able to escape from the communicative brainwash that form-oriented activities are not so good. And the fact that I put under C, message-oriented but boring, the fact that I've used but shows that I'm still in the communicative brainwash that says that message-oriented activities are always good. And for the others, I put and. Well, I won't go into details, but my use of and but reveals my own prejudice there. I find them very fascinating, the use of and but. So anyway, the basic thing that I want to say then is that in this area where, with all, I just check the written version to make sure there's nothing I've forgotten. No, that simply describes the four different A, B, C, D. And I did that verbally in any case. Form-oriented but boring, form-oriented but interesting, message-oriented but boring, etc. But within that, we can kind of evaluate for ourselves our own activities and also sort of use that to develop our repertoire of activities, trying to make use of that in relation to specific learners and specific needs. And there and then to continue exploring, inquiring for ourselves. And I've just put to finish up some of the key issues which, within any sort of framework, I think we need to, everybody, all of us need to explore for ourselves, really. The optimal combinations of analytical and experiential strategies will differ with different learners, different contexts, different teachers, but it's something where we need to explore. Ways to structure interaction more effectively, also when there's no teacher control. We can structure interaction well when the teacher is controlling it, but we haven't really explored a lot of ways of how to structure it when they're doing group work, so that they don't suddenly start using the mother tongue or use minimal language when we wish that they would use the foreign language creatively. Exploring ways to deepen the content of L2 communication, getting it so that it relates more to the real life, the relevance of the learners in the classroom. Exploring the role of the L1. Now, at the moment we're in a kind of funny situation where the jargon always says that using the L1 is wrong, but the practice shows that teachers use the L1, the first language, ever such a lot. So every teacher really needs to have, each of us needs to develop a sort of strategy for what do we think the L1 is good for and what not. Because the thing we have to aim for is to create a rich L2 environment in the classroom where they can learn the language. And then finally, exploring better the links between practice, theory and research. For example, through collaborative research, action research, exploratory practice, coming to conferences like this one, doing the kinds of things that Kumar mentioned towards the end of his talk, videoing our lessons, having discussions with colleagues in groups, and so gradually developing what seems to be a situated, contextual methodology, pedagogy for our own teaching